Greetings and welcome to Gripping Horror. This is Dayhouse Quarry, a once popular inland dive site that catered to adrenaline junkies of all types. Prior to its closure, the quarry bore witness to several tragic incidents that served as a reminder of the dangers that come with diving the site. In 2005, an Easter weekend getaway ended in tragedy after Hank Austin drowned, while his girlfriend, Janine Davidson Evans, died after her lungs were torn from a shift in pressure. Unfortunately, as more divers discovered the quarry, more tragedies occurred. Among these stories are those of Mary Redsill, Wojciech Uras, Lance Corporal George Partridge, Camilla Sokolowska, and Richard Sanders. These are the Dayhouse Quarry disasters. Dayhouse Quarry is a brilliantly clear dolomite deep quarry found on the cusp of the Wales-England border. The site is often referred to as Chepstow Quarry because of its neighbouring Chepstow township, nestled along the Wye River in between the Wye Valley and the Forest of Dean. This spectacular freshwater quarry dates back to 1938, when it was first marked on the map. The rocks in the Dayhouse Quarry formed 340 million years ago, during the early part of the Carboniferous period. In the late 1990s, the quarrying ceased at Dayhouse, and in 2003, the National Diving and Activity Centre, popularly known by its acronym and pronounced Ndac, opened in the former quarry. The Ndac was popular with technical and free divers due to the depths of the quarry, ranging from 6 to 85 metres. PADI and IANTD training was provided on site, and many British Sub-Aqua Club and Sub-Aqua Association clubs used the site for training. The Ndac also provided a range of sunken attractions at depths ranging from 6 to 76 metres to suit all diver levels. One of the very practical things at Dayhouse Quarry was that most of the sunken attractions had tethered lines and numbered buoys. These numbers corresponded to a displayed map of the area found in the dive centre. In the latter stages of the site, the Ndac had diversified its business and added other activities alongside diving, including open water swimming, an inflatable course, bungee jumps, a zip wire, and paddleboarding. The quarry is accessed by long pontoons. The deep area drops off, which is where most tech divers kit up and jump. From there, divers normally descend a 40-metre shot line alongside the wall, which then meets a sloping bottom down to about 85 metres. This line also branches off to a 9-metre and 6-metre decompression trapeze. Divers also had the option to surface swim out a few metres and take a blue water line straight down to the bottom. But that was not the norm. From 35 metres to the bottom, the visibility is usually pretty good. Around 8 metres, the surface temperature fluctuates, but from a depth of 40 metres, it stays pretty static at about 7 degrees Celsius. Now, shifting gears from the quarry, let's delve into the story of Mary Redsill. Mary Redsill, aged 54, possessed a heart of gold. Her kindness left a lasting impression on all those fortunate enough to have crossed paths with her. Mary was chair of the Tavistock fundraising branch of the Royal National Lifeboat Institution, the largest charity that saves lives at sea around the coasts of the United Kingdom, the Republic of Ireland, the Channel Islands, and the Isle of Man. Aside from her role as chairwoman, Mary continued to act as joint souvenir secretary with her husband, Roy Redsill. Mary and Roy were keen members of Sea Search, an organisation that trains volunteer divers to map seabed types and marine life. She and Roy travelled all the way from their house on the south coast to do sea search in Loch Long, as well as more dramatic trips to Loch Sunat and Isle of Lismore. The couple had always enjoyed diving, especially together, and had become experienced divers, training in decompression techniques in 2005. The pair had made more than 1,350 dives over many years, but always using compressed air. On November the 8th, 2014, they gathered with their dear friend and fellow diver, Claire Boxall, to meticulously plan their upcoming deep dive, scheduled for November the 15th at the Ndac. Mary and Roy had used the centre previously and knew the layout quite well. The dive was scheduled to take 44 minutes. The plan was to descend to 60 metres, spend 15 metres at that depth, and then start their decompression steps to return to the surface. For the dive, Mary and Roy decided to use Trimix, a mixture of oxygen, helium, and nitrogen. It was the first time they had used Trimix. As stated earlier, they had only ever used compressed air on their dives. Mary appeared perfectly fine on the surface as they conducted their equipment checks. They descended smoothly together to a depth of 60 metres without any issues. However, as they began swimming back toward the pontoon to start their decompression, a change in her behaviour became apparent. Mary seemed unsure and unfocused and was making ineffective movements. She began to sink, and Roy tried to manage her buoyancy as well as his own. There was no understanding in her eyes, and although there was some water in her mask, she made no attempt to clear it. Suddenly, Mary dropped below 60 metres, and Roy saw a rush of air from her mouthpiece. She signalled that she could not breathe. With very few options, Roy decided to take the risk of decompression sickness and the bends by swiftly ascending to the surface with Mary. Once at the surface, the staff did their very best to help Mary, but she died at the scene, and Roy was airlifted to a decompression unit following the incident as he suffered from the bends. 1 month after the incident, Roy started a fundraiser for the DDRC, where he continued to receive excellent care following the accident. Thankfully, he was able to recover fully. Expert witness Thomas Anthony, who provides technical support to Navy divers, was asked by the coroner to check all the equipment Mary had used. He said that the specific Trimix gas they were using was not ideal for a 60-metre dive. Thomas also stated that it seemed as though she still had plenty of gas at the time of the incident, but 2 regulators in her equipment were not performing correctly and did not appear to have been serviced recently. This meant she would have to make a lot more respiratory effort to get the amount of gas she needed. Also, Trimix itself is dense and more difficult to breathe at that depth, which would have added to her problems. A third factor that affected Mary is the high nitrogen content in the gas mix, which posed narcotic, and because she had to work hard to breathe, there would also have been a buildup of carbon dioxide in her blood. Senior coroner Katie Scarrett said the cause of death was a gas embolism and a lung-related pulmonary barotrauma and a pulmonary tumour. Katie reiterated that Mary had been in good health before the dive, but had died from a buildup of gas in her blood due to her substandard diving equipment. Following Mary's death, the waters of Dayhouse Quarry remained eerily tranquil until tragedy struck once more, 3 years later, on October the 8th, 2017. Vigimas Uras, a 28-year-old truck driver from Upminster in Essex, had a deep passion for diving. Those who knew him often described him as an enthusiastic diver who would drive during the night and dive during the day. Diving was not just a hobby for him, it was his life. Under the guidance of dive instructor Alexander Fox, Vigimas had recently achieved his Tech 40 certification, allowing him to dive up to 40 metres. Eager to put his newfound skills to the test, he had a trip to the Ndac in the works. On October the 8th, 2017, Vigimas arrived at the quarry for a morning group dive. Following the initial dive, he made an announcement in the afternoon that he planned to undertake a solo dive and borrowed a 7-litre cylinder for this purpose. He descended once more into the water at 3:10 p.m. The GMAS dive computer indicated that he had reached a depth of 71 meters, which exceeded his level of competence. Diving solo at that depth was not permitted with his level of training, and this decision posed significant risks. He was also overweighted and had dived with his equipment set at extreme levels. 20 minutes into his dive, at about 3:30 p.m., as analysed by his dive computers, the GMAS shot uncontrollably to the surface, causing an air embolism to form in his lungs, and eventually biometric trauma as his chest ruptured. The GMAS ascended in minutes when he should have taken more than an hour. Thus, he missed 1 hour of decompression by coming up so fast, without giving the nitrogen a chance to dissolve completely from his blood. The reason for his uncontrolled ascent was not entirely clear, but according to the coroner's report, it was likely caused by how his equipment was set up. The GMAS was found face down and unresponsive at the surface 20 minutes after his departure. Firefighter Paul Hargreaves, who had just completed a dive, had used an Ndac defibrillator as well as carrying out CPR for 20 minutes in a bid to resuscitate the GMAS before paramedics had taken over. The paramedics observed severe chest injuries to the GMAS and did everything in their power to save him. Unfortunately, it was not enough, and the GMAS passed away on scene. An inquest opened on the 13th of October, 5 days after the GMAS death, and adjourned until March. Similarly to Mary's case, Coroner Katie Skerritt reviewed the GMAS case. She stated that he was a qualified diver, but he had exceeded the limits of his certification. She concluded by saying it was a tragic accident involving a 28-year-old man doing what he enjoyed doing when he made a fatal error. It did not take long for the Ndac to make headlines again. Merely 5 months later, on March the 26th, 2018, Lance Corporal George Partridge failed to surface from its waters during the final week of his Army diver course. 27-year-old Lance Corporal George dedicated 8 years of his life to serving with 26 Engineer Regiment, based in Burnham Down, Wiltshire. His commitment included a tour of duty in Afghanistan in 2012. George was not only a soldier, but also a loving husband, eagerly anticipating the arrival of his first child. His dedication and service was soon to be recognised with a well-deserved promotion to the rank of corporal. On Monday the 26th of March, 2018, George was into the last week of a 5-week Army Advanced Diving 2 course at the Ndac, along with 11 other trainee divers. The students had been expecting to carry out their scheduled 19th dive to a depth of 21 to 23 meters. But in a decision that would be questioned by the jury, it was decided to skip this and proceed straight to dive 20, descending to the deeper of 2 Wessex helicopters at 26 to 27 meters. The divers were told to take a heavy 53-meter distance line down and run it between the shot line and wreck. Equipped with primary and backup air cylinders and equipped with a full face mask with radio communication system, George descended on a line with dive buddy Stephen Hart at 11 a.m. Their task was expected to take no more than 10 minutes. The comm system was so unreliable that rope signals were normally used. Notably, the comms had not worked for George and Stephen during the dive, either between themselves or with their service attendants. Therefore, George and Stephen were generally relying on signals by tugs on their lifeline. The distance line George and Stephen were carrying had become entangled on their descent, but, unable to hear each other on the comm system, they had used hand signals to arrange that Stephen would hold the line and feed it to George as he swam towards the helicopter. The line was discovered to be 3 times longer than it should have been, introducing an unnecessary risk of entanglement. Visibility was about 10 meters, and it just went black after that. As Stephen was paying out the rope, he lost sight of George when he got to the 2 large rocks en route to the helicopter. Stephen then got a signal to come back. Once George reached the helicopter, he sent the rope signals to the surface, found, started and finished work. But nothing after that. Soldier Thomas Moore, who acted as communications officer for the dive that day, said he received a lifeline signal from George saying, "You are holding me too tight on the lifeline. Give me some slack." A couple of minutes later, he again asked for more slack on the line. Thomas then tried to relay to George on the comms to come back up, but he got no response. After Stephen surfaced, Sergeant Dolly had been concerned to see a continuous stream of bubbles, suggesting a free flow before they had stopped. When the bubbles stopped, they really started to worry. Standby diver Corporal Michael Watson was dispatched to see what had happened to George. He had found him laying on his back at a depth of about 24 meters. His mask, still attached to the hose, was hanging off his face. Michael brought George to the surface in less than a minute, 17 minutes after the start of the dive. Calls had already gone out to the emergency services and for on-site assistance. Tragically, George's life could not be saved. Both of George's cylinders were found to be empty. The trainees had been warned to check the switch blocks that regulated airflow from their cylinders into their masks every few minutes, because a knock could cause both cylinders to start flowing at once, with the diver unaware that this was happening. This leaves a diver with less air to get back to the surface. They were also told to check their air gauges every 10 minutes, an interval the jury considered too long. In the drill before the dive, in which George had played the casualty, with Stephen his rescuer, Sergeant Dolly recalled that George's switch block had been checked and found to be closed. The inquest was told by medical experts that George's cause of death was sudden death in adult. A post-mortem examination had revealed that George had previously undiagnosed minor anomaly in his right coronary artery, and sudden cardiac death syndrome had originally been given as cause of death. While George had been rated by instructors as top student in his group, there had also been doubts about his endurance. 5 separate medical episodes had occurred during various endurance exercises, but these had not been flagged up as forming a significant pattern. The jury found that the cardiac event which ended George's life was due to depletion of air during the dive, either directly or because of exertion and shock resulting from the lack of air. The jury highlighted multiple additional failings amongst the dive, which includes the change in the dive program made without permission, and the fact that neither Sergeant Dolly nor the trainees had been taught how to carry out the air endurance calculations that would have indicated how much faster air would run out on a deep, task-loaded dive. The use of such tables was introduced to Army diver training soon after George's death. Concerned about the radio communications breakdown, the jury also wanted to know why the Digicom 1 system, introduced for Army divers in 2002 and intended for use for up to 15 years, had still been in use at the time of the fatality. Navy Diving Life Support Manager Ian Taylor said that this was because it remained market leader and was basically the best out there. The dive supervisor, Staff Sergeant Justin Dolly, was questioned about the reason behind the decision not to go ahead with the planned dive, and he initially said it was felt that the dive could be missed because the previous week the trainees had done 2 deeper dives, including one to 30 meters in the Solent. But he also agreed with the Assistant Gloucestershire Coroner, Roland Wooderson, who suggested that the reason for the change was to do something more interesting and reach the helicopter, delivering a detailed narrative verdict rather than the standard brief summary. Assistant Coroner Roland Wooderson pointed to significant points of failure, both in the Army diving course the soldier was undertaking and in the training of his dive supervisor. A subsequent Royal Navy Service Inquiry panel had published a comprehensive report stating that George had been using faulty diving equipment. Criticising the Army course, that report had made 53 recommendations on remedial action. The loss of George was felt hard by his squadron, the regiment and the corps, as well as everyone in the wider army who had the privilege of working with him. Tragically, just 7 months after George's passing, the quarry would claim its 6th life. On the late morning of October the 6th, 2018, Arta and Kamila Sokolowska, both experienced divers residing in Reading and originally from Poland, arrived at the site with a friend. The trio prepared to carry out a dive to 60 meters. Kamila, aged 40, hadn't ventured to such depths before, but with Arta being a certified PADI open water instructor, she found the confidence she needed to take the dive on. Before their descent, they diligently checked their equipment at the surface, ensuring everything was in proper working condition. Kamila was diving on a single rented 12-litre air cylinder, whilst Arthur and the friend of the couple were on twin sets. On their descent, Kamila had signalled that she had a problem with her buoyancy control device inflator, but had then indicated that she wished to continue. Arta then continued down ahead of her. After their bottom time, the group planned to ascend. During their ascent, Arta noticed that Kamila was not pulling herself up on the line and found that she was struggling, with her mask filling up. Witnessing his wife struggling, at a depth of 35 meters, Arta decided to risk making a rapid ascent to get Kamila back to the surface, but she lost consciousness and had a heart attack on the way up. At the surface, assistance came quickly in response to Arta's calls, and a now distressed and emotional Arta shouted, "I killed my wife." A diver also using the site was on the pontoon kitting up when Arta first popped up, shortly followed by Kamila. The diver entered the water and towed Kamila to the pontoon, dekitted and helped pass her up. Camilla's kit was very negatively buoyant when the diver removed it, and there didn't seem to be any gas left to inflate. The diver's buddy quickly arrived and started working on her, giving her CPR and AED treatment, and within 15 minutes, there was a fast response vehicle, 3 ambulances and an air ambulance on scene. But it wasn't enough, unfortunately. Similarly to the previous deaths at the Ndac, an inquest was held regarding Camilla's case. The findings of the inquest raised several crucial points. Firstly, Camilla's experience level, or the potential lack thereof, was called into question based on the known elements of the dive. Diving air below 40 meters, especially for someone without prior experience at these depths, appeared to be an inexplicable choice. Given that it was an inland quarry, the water at such depths was likely extremely cold. Secondly, the tank volume of 12 litres in a single tank configuration was insufficient for the dive. Even with a reasonable surface air consumption rate of 15 litres per minute, her manometer would have dropped 9 bars per minute. Thirdly, the use of standard air, with its gas density of 9 grams per litre at depth, combined with the potential for nitrogen narcosis, contributed to the challenges faced during the dive. Fourthly, her equipment malfunction, specifically regarding the proper functioning of the buoyancy control device. As stated prior, her buoyancy control device power inflator was found to be restricted and slow to inflate. As a result of this, Kamila had to find and pull herself up the rope, increasing her workload immensely. Home Office pathologist Dr. Stephen Ledbetter said that the cause of death suggested that it could have been either the heart attack or cerebral gas embolism, or a combination of the two. In conjunction with the coroner's comments, it was inferred that a combination of factors, including negative buoyancy, increased work of breathing, her anxiety and relative inexperience, and possibly exposure to thermal stress, may have collectively contributed and led Kamila to stop breathing during the ascent. Approximately 6 months following Camilla's tragic accident, the Ndac experienced another heartbreaking incident, marking the final tragedy before its closure. Richard Sanders, aged 52, embodied the essence of an all-round good bloke. According to those who knew him, he was the type of person who was always willing to lend a helping hand and support those around him. Richard had a passion for diving that had grown immensely in recent years, and he had truly become a proficient diver, having completed over 200 dives to a maximum depth of 40 meters. His dedication to the sport was evident through his volunteer work as a training officer at his local British sub-aqua club, wanting to be involved with diving even when he wasn't in the water. Richard had an expedition to the Royal Navy's wartime deep water harbour at Scapa Flow scheduled for later in the year. He and a friend of his named Steve Smith had planned to dive the wrecks of the German High Seas Fleet off the Orkney Islands at depths of 40 meters. They had hoped to be part of an expedition to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the scuttling of the ships. Determined to make the most of the trip, he decided to enroll in the TDI Tri-Mix diver course at the Ndac to be able to safely react to any problems that he might encounter during the dives. The course was scheduled to run from the 10th to the 13th of November of that year. It was designed to show divers how to minimize the effects of narcosis by adding helium to offset the nitrogen in their breathing gas. While taking the course, Richard's TDI instructor, Mark Carwick, planned to teach him how to plan and execute dives, utilizing as little as 18% oxygen and diving to a maximum depth of 60 meters, with a blend of helium appropriate for the planned depth. On the first dive of the course, Richard's excitement and nerves seemed to get the better of him. As he descended into the depths of the water, Mark noticed that he was all over the place. Richard's head was down, and it was clear that he was struggling to maintain control and composure underwater. Recognizing the importance of safety, Mark made the difficult but necessary decision to terminate the dive prematurely. As they surfaced, Richard couldn't help but feel disappointed in himself. Later that afternoon, a second dive presented Richard with an opportunity for redemption. Determined to overcome his earlier challenges, he had regained his confidence and looked comfortable in what he was doing. A second student joined the team on day 2, and he and Richard completed a full skills circuit, which included taking off their masks and simulating a decompression ascent. Their second dive commenced later in the day at 3:59 p.m, and it was expected to last for 28 minutes. Richard had been designated as the dive leader. 20 minutes into the dive, and at a depth of 45 meters, Mark couldn't help but notice that Richard began to glance at his gauges, even though it wasn't necessary at that stage of the dive. This observation raised a subtle concern. Mark decided to bring the dive to a premature end and gave the appropriate signal. Richard turned to the other student, who had already deployed his marker buoy and deployed his own marker buoy with textbook efficiency. Richard then had to disconnect a hose to fill the surface marker buoy, but he didn't reconnect the hose. Mark moved in closer because he wanted Richard to reconnect the hose before they began their ascent. It was at this point Richard gave Mark a signal that he was out of air, but Mark could see on his gauges that he did have air as his cylinder was still approximately half full. Mark gave him his spare long hose regulator, which caused lots of bubbles, and he soon realized that they were in desperate trouble. This is when Richard removed his regulator and bolted to the surface, taking Mark with him. The alarms on Mark's wrist was telling him they were ascending too fast. Richard was doing his best to rise to the surface, while Mark grabbed his belt to try to slow him down. It was a fight for survival. Richard was trying to pull Mark up, and Mark was trying to pull Richard down. At 23 meters, Richard bolted again. Mark was terrified as the lines became entangled. It is at this point that Richard became unconscious. The other dive student said he saw something going on between Richard and Mark, but they then disappeared from view. Mark changed his wrist computer to allow him to resurface in the quickest time possible. He was on the surface at 4:37 p.m. and swam with Richard some distance to the nearby pontoon. It would have been a physically demanding distance to swim with a full kit on. Nobody was on the pontoon to raise the alarm. Therefore, Mark clipped Richard to a ladder before raising the alarm at 4:40 p.m. When the alarm was raised, 2 people from the offices attended with a defibrillator and oxygen, having already called the emergency services at 4:46 p.m. They proceeded with chest compressions until the ambulance paramedics arrived at 4:56 p.m. Unfortunately, Richard was declared dead at 5:18 p.m. An inquest into his death was opened and adjourned to September the 19th by the Gloucestershire coroner. The medical cause of death was determined to be 1A immersion pulmonary edema, which led to asphyxiation. A medical expert told the inquest that a diver suffering from this condition will become breathless and think there was a problem with their gas supply and check their gauges, followed by coughing and disorientation. The symptoms get worse as they become vertical and start ascending. There is no screening test that can definitively determine whether an individual will suffer from IPO, but there are a number of known factors which increase the likelihood of an individual being subject to IPO. A medical questionnaire given to Richard was completed before diving. Had he answered yes to any of the specific set of questions, he would not have been able to dive. However, this inquest heard that Richard answered no to a number of questions when, more accurately, some of these answers should have been yes. When asked if there was a history of drug or alcohol abuse, a history of blackouts or fainting, or if he suffered from back problems, he said no. But if he had said yes, further medical assessment would have been required and the dive would not have gone ahead. An inquest heard that Richard had been unconscious for 8 minutes underwater, 3 minutes while being towed to the pontoon, and a further 6 minutes before CPR could be commenced. Medical experts concluded that if there had been surface cover on the pontoon, these timings would have been reduced by 3 minutes. But in all likelihood, this would not have had any effect on the unsuccessful outcome over the resuscitation of Richard. Following Richard's death, the Ndac continued to be open to the public for about 3 more years. On the 18th of February, 2022, the Ndac issued a statement via social media saying that the site was permanently closed. The following month, it was reported that the site had been purchased by a company seeking to develop equipment to enable people to live deep underwater. And so, after almost 2 decades in operation, what remains of the Ndac are the memories of all those who had a chance to experience its wonders. May Hank Austin, Janine Davidson, Mary Redsill, Wojciech Uras, George Partridge, Kamila Sokolowska, and Richard Sanders rest in peace. This has been Gripping Horror. I hope to see you in the next one.